England, 1815. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Thornfield Manor as Miss Eleanor Winters stood with trembling hands clasped before her in the suffocating warmth of the drawing-room. Despite the cheerful fire crackling in the marble hearth and the rich crimson draperies adorning the walls, Eleanor felt a chill permeate her very soul as the Duchess of Westmoreland circled her like a predatory cat toying with a cornered mouse. At 22, Eleanor had known her share of hardship since her scholar father had died, leaving nothing but debts and precious books, yet nothing had prepared her for this moment of absolute humiliation. The Duchess, a woman of imposing height and aristocratic features that might once have been beautiful before years of sneering, had hardened them into cold disdain, paused to examine Eleanor from head to toe, her gaze lingering critically on the modest blue muslin gown that represented the very best of Eleanor's meagre wardrobe. With each passing second of scrutiny, Eleanor felt herself diminish further, her position as governess to the neighbouring Thornfield children suddenly feeling more precarious than ever before. When the Duchess finally spoke, her voice cut through the room like winter frost, each syllable precisely formed to inflict maximum damage to the young woman's dignity. "You are too poor to marry my son," she declared, the words falling like physical blows upon Eleanor's already fragile composure. "A governess with no connections? Preposterous. My son requires a wife of proper breeding and fortune, not some penniless nobody who has clearly set her cap at him most shamelessly." The Duchess reached into a small silk purse hanging from her wrist and withdrew a folded banknote, pressing it into Eleanor's palm with fingers cold as marble, despite the overheated room. "This should compensate for any disappointment you may feel at the termination of whatever understanding you believed existed between you and Lord Thornfield." The tears Eleanor had been desperately fighting threatened to spill over, but she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, determined not to give the Duchess the satisfaction of seeing her weep. The banknote burned in her palm like a brand of shame, yet Eleanor knew her precarious financial situation left her little choice but to accept this insulting payment. The Duchess continued her verbal assault, detailing the lineage of the Westmoreland family stretching back to William the Conqueror, and emphasizing how someone of Eleanor's common background could never hope to meet the standards required of those who married into such noble blood. Each word drove Eleanor further into despair as she realized how foolish she had been to believe that Lord Thornfield's attentions had been sincere, that his letters and smiles and gentle conversations in the garden might truly lead to a future together. The drawing-room that had seemed merely warm when she entered now felt positively stifling, the ornate furniture and priceless paintings on the walls serving as harsh reminders of the vast gulf in station between herself and the family whose matriarch now stood destroying her dreams with such cold efficiency. Eleanor fought to maintain her composure, to keep her spine straight and her chin lifted, even as her heart shattered into countless pieces within her breast. The moment Eleanor escaped the suffocating confines of the drawing-room, her carefully maintained composure shattered like fine china, dashed against stone. She fled through the servants' passage and out into the rain-soaked gardens, grateful that the downpour might disguise the hot tears now streaming freely down her face. The formal rose garden, normally so pristine and orderly, mirrored her own disarray as wind whipped through the carefully tended beds, scattering crimson petals across the gravel paths like droplets of blood. Eleanor ran until her lungs burned, until she reached the small stone bench tucked beneath a weeping willow at the furthest edge of the property, where she finally allowed herself to collapse. Rain soaked through her thin blue muslin within moments, plastering her chestnut curls to her neck and shoulders, but Eleanor welcomed the cold as a counterpoint to the burning humiliation that scorched her from within. The banknote remained clutched in her fist, crumpled now beyond recognition, yet she could not bring herself to either discard it or smooth it carefully away. £5, a fortune to someone in her position, enough to see her through several months should she lose her position as governess, which now seemed entirely possible given the Duchess' interference. What bitter irony that her salvation and her shame should be contained in the same small piece of paper. Eleanor uncurled her fingers, watching as raindrops fell upon the crumpled note, blurring the ink slightly. Pride demanded she tear it to pieces and scatter it to the wind alongside the rose petals, yet practicality, that constant companion of the poor, whispered that such gestures were luxuries she could ill afford. Her mother had passed 2 winters ago, after a lingering illness that had consumed their meager savings, and her father had followed within the year, leaving Eleanor entirely alone in the world, save for the distant cousin who had secured her this position at Thornfield. "I may be poor, but I am not without dignity," she whispered, her words immediately snatched away by the gusting wind. The rain continued to fall, mingling with her tears until she could no longer distinguish between them, washing away the outward signs of her distress, even as the pain continued to pulse within her breast. Gradually, as the initial shock of the Duchess' cruelty faded, Eleanor felt a different emotion rising within her chest, a slow-burning anger that warmed her chilled limbs more effectively than any fire could have done. Who was this woman to judge her worth by the contents of her purse rather than the content of her character? What right had she to dismiss years of education and gentle upbringing simply because they had not come with a fortune attached? Eleanor slowly rose from the bench, her sodden skirts heavy around her ankles, and carefully folded the banknote, tucking it into her small reticule. She would neither destroy it in a futile gesture, nor spend it unless absolute necessity demanded it. Instead, she would keep it as a reminder that wealth and title did not confer nobility of spirit, and that true dignity came not from one's circumstances, but from how one faced them. The rain intensified, driving Eleanor to seek shelter in the small stone pavilion at the eastern edge of the rose garden. She had scarcely settled onto the marble bench inside when a tall shadow darkened the entrance, causing her heart to stutter with alarm. There stood a man whose commanding presence instantly filled the small space, making Eleanor acutely aware of her bedraggled appearance. The Duke of Westmoreland regarded her with keen grey eyes that missed nothing, from her tear-stained cheeks to her sodden gown clinging uncomfortably to her shivering form. At 35, the Duke cut an imposing figure, his broad shoulders nearly spanning the pavilion doorway, his raven hair, though dampened by rain, still precisely arranged in a fashion that spoke of natural authority rather than vanity. Unlike his son, whose features held a boyish charm, the Duke possessed a face carved by experience, with strong lines around his mouth, suggesting he rarely smiled, though nothing in his expression now indicated unkindness. "Miss Winters," he said, his deep voice barely raised above the drumming of rain upon the pavilion roof, yet carrying a gravity that demanded attention. "Why are you here in this downpour? Has something occurred?" The intimate enclosure of the pavilion, with rain sheeting down around them, created an odd bubble of privacy that made Eleanor feel simultaneously trapped and protected. She struggled to find words that might explain her presence without revealing the humiliation she had suffered at his mother's hands. The Duke stepped fully into the pavilion, removing his greatcoat in one fluid motion to offer it to her. The gesture performed with such natural courtesy that Eleanor found herself accepting it before she could consider the impropriety. The heavy wool, still warm from his body, and carrying a faint scent of sandalwood and leather, settled around her shoulders like armor. In her years at Thornfield, Eleanor had glimpsed the Duke only from afar, as he visited infrequently, spending most of his time managing his vast estates or attending to his duties in Parliament. Rumours among the servants painted him as stern but fair, demanding excellence but rewarding it generously, a man respected rather than loved, yet respected deeply by all who served him. Now, standing before him with her hair plastered to her scalp and her eyes swollen from weeping, Eleanor felt strangely unafraid, despite his rank and power. Perhaps it was the simple human kindness of the offered coat, or the directness of his gaze that held concern rather than the condescension she had faced from his mother, but something told Eleanor that this man, whatever his other qualities, was not cruel. The contrast between mother and son struck her forcibly, like finding warmth in the heart of winter, and gave her courage to speak despite the tremor in her voice. "Miss Winters," he prompted again when she remained silent too long, his tone suggesting he would not leave without an answer. "I asked if something has occurred to distress you." Eleanor hesitated, torn between propriety and the raw honesty the moment seemed to demand. Something in the Duke's steady gaze convinced her that prevarication would be both futile and unwelcome. "I have just had an interview with Her Grace, the Duchess," she admitted finally, her voice steadier than she had expected. "Your mother summoned me to inform me that I am too poor and too common to marry Lord Thornfield, and to offer compensation for my disappointment." As she spoke, Eleanor watched the Duke's expression transform, the concerned inquiry hardening into something far more formidable. A muscle tightened in his jaw, and his hands, hanging at his sides, clenched into fists before he mastered himself with visible effort. Outside, thunder crashed so close that the small pavilion seemed to tremble, nature providing dramatic accompaniment to the tension crackling between them. When the Duke finally spoke, his voice was deceptively quiet, yet carried an undercurrent of steel that made Eleanor grateful his anger was not directed at her. "My mother has overstepped her authority. Lord Thornfield's engagement to you is his choice, not hers." The statement, delivered with such absolute certainty, momentarily robbed Eleanor of breath. Engagement? She had received letters from Lord Thornfield expressing admiration, certainly, and they had enjoyed several chaperoned walks in the garden where he had spoken of future happiness, but nothing had been formalized. The Duke's brow furrowed as he studied her confusion, his keen intelligence clearly assembling pieces of a puzzle she herself could not yet see. "Did my son not speak to you directly of marriage before his departure for London last week?" The directness of the question left no room for anything but truth. "No, Your Grace. Though his letters suggested he harbored such intentions, I would never have presumed without an explicit offer." The Duke exhaled slowly, his broad shoulders relaxing fractionally, though the intensity of his gaze never wavered. "I see. It appears my mother has acted not only inappropriately but prematurely." His expression softened marginally as he regarded Eleanor's evident distress. "Please understand, Miss Winters, that while the Duchess may control much of society with her disapproval, she does not control me, nor does she dictate whom my son may marry. That choice belongs to him alone, and from what I have observed during my visits, he has chosen wisely." The unexpected vindication from such an authoritative source sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's chilled body. She had expected dismissal, perhaps even further humiliation, but instead found an ally where she least anticipated one. The complex dynamics of this powerful family began to reveal themselves, with the Duke standing as a bulwark against his mother's manipulations rather than supporting them. Eleanor sensed that behind his controlled exterior lay a man of deep principle, one who valued justice over convenience, and who recognized worth beyond the narrow parameters of fortune and bloodlines. Rain continued to drum against the pavilion roof, creating a curtain of water that isolated them from the rest of the world, as if they existed momentarily outside the strict social hierarchies that would normally keep them apart. The Duke studied Eleanor's face for a moment longer, then turned to look out at the intensifying storm, his profile outlined against the grey curtain of rain. "There is more you should know, Miss Winters," he said, his voice lowering to a tone that immediately sent a chill of foreboding through Eleanor's already trembling form. "My son, Lord Thornfield, has been called away quite suddenly to the continent. He has accepted a commission in the cavalry and departed for Spain 3 days ago. Napoleon has escaped his exile on Elba, and England once again finds itself at war." The news struck Eleanor like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. The war had seemed so distant, a concern for politicians and generals, not something that would reach into her life and snatch away what fragile hope remained. The Duke continued, his voice grave as he delivered the final, devastating revelation. "Given the nature of this conflict, it is unlikely Edward will return to English shores for several years, if at all. The military life has always called to him, and I fear he has found his true purpose in it." Eleanor felt as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly vanished. First, the Duchess' cruel dismissal, and now this news that the man whose attention had given her a glimpse of a different future had left without a word. "Edward never mentioned any military ambitions," she whispered, more to herself than to the Duke. "I received his letter only yesterday, professing his intentions toward me. I thought perhaps when he returned from London." Her voice trailed off as the full implications crashed over her. She would remain at Thornfield Manor, watching the seasons change, growing older, her prospects diminishing with each passing year, while Edward Thornfield lived a life of adventure far from English shores. The pavilion grew noticeably darker as clouds thickened overhead, the storm reaching its full intensity. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the Duke's face, which now held an expression Eleanor could not quite decipher, concern mingled with something deeper, more complex. "My son can be impulsive, Miss Winters. He writes of intentions one day and rides to war the next, without considering the hearts left behind." Outside, the wind had risen to a howl, bending the rosebushes nearly to the ground and stripping petals that whirled through the air like pale ghosts. Eleanor felt a similar storm raging within her breast, confusion and hurt battling with a strange sense of inevitability. Perhaps she had been foolish to believe that happiness might be so easily within her reach. The daughter of a scholar with no fortune or connections, entertaining hopes of marriage to the heir of a dukedom, it now seemed like a child's fairy tale, insubstantial as morning mist. The Duke watched her closely, seemingly measuring her reaction to this devastating news. She straightened her spine with effort, determined not to collapse under this new weight. Life had taught Eleanor Winters that paths rarely unfolded as expected, and that survival depended on adapting to whatever circumstances fate delivered, however cruel they might seem in the moment. A profound silence fell between them, broken only by the steady drumming of rain that now seemed to be lessening in intensity. Eleanor became acutely aware of her precarious position, a governess whose relationship with the family heir had drawn unwanted attention from the formidable Duchess. Her position at Thornfield would become untenable once news of this morning spread, yet the prospect of seeking another post with a reference tainted by scandal filled her with dread. The Duke cleared his throat, drawing her attention back to his imposing figure, though his expression had softened noticeably. "Miss Winters," he began, his deep voice measured and deliberate, "I find myself in a position to offer you a solution that may prove mutually beneficial. My sister, Lady Catherine, resides at Westmoreland Hall and is in need of a companion. Her health has been delicate since childhood, confining her largely to the estate, and her previous companion recently married. I believe someone of your intelligence and gentle manner would suit her admirably." Eleanor blinked in surprise, this unexpected offer momentarily rendering her speechless. Westmoreland Hall was the Duke's primary estate, renowned for its magnificence, and the position of companion to a lady of rank was considerably more elevated than that of a governess. Yet pride warred with practical necessity within her breast, for accepting felt dangerously close to admitting defeat, to fleeing from difficulty rather than facing it with courage. The Duke seemed to read her thoughts with uncanny accuracy, for he continued before she could formulate a response. "I would not offer charity, Miss Winters, nor is this a consolation for my son's inconstancy. My sister truly needs someone of intelligence and kindness. You possess both qualities in abundance, from what I have observed during my visits to Thornfield. Lady Catherine is a scholar in her own right, with particular interest in botany and literature. I believe you would find much common ground." As he spoke, Eleanor noticed a subtle change in the light around them. The storm was passing, and weak sunlight now filtered through the pavilion windows, casting a golden glow that seemed almost like a benediction. This offer represented more than employment, she realized. It offered escape from the humiliation awaiting her at Thornfield, a fresh beginning in a household where the Duchess' influence, while still present, would be balanced by the Duke's more equitable nature. What struck Eleanor most profoundly was the perception this man had shown, not only in recognizing her distress but in offering a solution that preserved her dignity rather than diminishing it further. He had seen beyond her current bedraggled state to the educated gentlewoman circumstances had forced into service, and had offered her a position more befitting her abilities and background. The rain had nearly stopped now, the gardens around them glistening with droplets that caught the emerging sunlight, transforming the recently ravaged landscape into something hopeful and renewed. The journey to Westmoreland Hall had taken nearly 2 days, winding through the verdant countryside of northern England, each mile carrying Eleanor further from the humiliation she had suffered at Thornfield Manor. As the carriage crested the final hill, She caught her first glimpse of her new home and felt her breath catch in her throat. The hall rose from the mist-shrouded valley like something from a medieval romance, its grey stone towers and Gothic spires reaching toward the heavens as if in supplication. Eleanor clutched her small reticule, which contained all the personal treasures she had been able to bring, feeling suddenly small and insignificant in the face of such grandeur. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel of the circular drive, before coming to a halt beneath an intricately carved stone portico. A livered footman assisted her descent, his formal bow suggesting a respect Eleanor had rarely experienced as a governess. The massive oak doors swung open to reveal an entrance hall of such magnificence that Eleanor had to force herself not to gape like a country girl at her first assembly. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows set high in the walls, casting jewel-toned patterns across the marble floor and illuminating ancestral portraits and ancient tapestries with an almost ethereal glow. The elderly butler who greeted her explained that the Duchess remained at the London residence for the season, information that caused Eleanor to release a breath she had not realized she was holding. The 2 weeks since accepting the Duke's offer had been filled with anxiety about facing the woman who had so cruelly dismissed her, and the knowledge that this confrontation was delayed provided welcome relief. A soft voice called her name, drawing her attention to the grand staircase where a slender figure slowly descended. Lady Catherine Vallemont, the Duke's sister, appeared as delicate as the finest porcelain, her skin so pale it seemed almost translucent, yet her smile radiated a warmth that instantly put Eleanor at ease. Despite her obvious physical frailty, evidenced by the careful way she navigated each step with the assistance of a carved ivory cane, her blue eyes sparkled with intelligence and genuine pleasure. "Miss Winters, how delighted I am to finally meet you," Lady Catherine said as she approached, her voice gentle yet filled with unmistakable sincerity. "My brother wrote that you share my love of literature and botanical studies. I confess I have been counting the days until your arrival, for Westmoreland, while beautiful, can be terribly isolating without stimulating companionship." The unexpected warmth of this welcome, so different from what Eleanor had anticipated, caused a lump to form in her throat. Lady Catherine, seemingly sensing her emotion, linked her arm through Eleanor's with natural ease, as if they were already dear friends rather than mistress and paid companion. As Lady Catherine led her through the magnificent hall, pointing out features of interest and sharing amusing anecdotes about her ancestors, Eleanor felt something within her begin to unfurl, like a flower turning toward unexpected sunshine after a devastating storm. A fortnight passed at Westmoreland Hall with such surprising swiftness that Eleanor scarcely noticed the transition from newcomer to established resident. The library had quickly become her favorite refuge, a magnificent room whose walls disappeared behind floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound volumes collected over centuries by generations of Vallemonts. On this particular afternoon, warm autumn sunlight streamed through tall, mullioned windows, casting golden rectangles across the intricate Persian carpet and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like minuscule fairy creatures. Eleanor sat beside Lady Catherine, on the worn leather sofa positioned near the massive stone fireplace, where a cheerful blaze dispelled the early autumn chill. She had discovered that Lady Catherine, though well-educated, found reading physically taxing due to her condition, and had taken to reading aloud during their afternoons together. Today they had ventured into Shakespeare, with Eleanor giving each character a distinct voice as she brought A Midsummer Night's Dream to vivid life. So engrossed were both women in the magical forest of Athens that neither noticed the library door opening nor the tall figure who paused on the threshold, arrested by the tableau before him. The Duke of Westmoreland stood perfectly still, his customary stern expression softening as he observed Eleanor, her cheeks flushed with enthusiasm, hands gesturing expressively as she transformed herself from imperious Titania to mischievous Puck, with nothing but her voice and animated features. His sister, usually so pale and reserved, was laughing with unrestrained delight, her eyes brighter than he had seen them in years. For several minutes, he remained unobserved, something unfamiliar and warm unfurling in his chest as he watched Eleanor, noting how the sunlight caught auburn highlights in her chestnut hair. How intelligence sparkled in her eyes, how her entire countenance transformed when freed from the constraints of formal propriety. It was Lady Catherine who finally noticed his presence, her delighted exclamation drawing Eleanor's attention. She immediately fell silent, colour flooding her cheeks as she rose and curtsied, the book clutched to her chest like a shield. The Duke moved into the room, the subtle scent of leather and wood smoke enveloping him as he approached the women. His gaze remained fixed on Eleanor, whose earlier animation had been replaced by the proper reserve expected of a companion. Something about this transformation troubled him, though he could not immediately identify why. "You have brought life back to this room, Miss Winters," he said, his deep voice unusually gentle. "It has been too long since these walls heard laughter." The simple sincerity of the compliment, so different from the practiced gallantries of society, caused Eleanor to look up and meet his gaze directly. In that moment of unguarded connection, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended the barriers of rank and circumstance, brief as a heartbeat yet somehow profound. Lady Catherine, observing them with keen interest, smiled to herself, for she had begun to nurture hopes that her brother's interest in their new companion might extend beyond mere appreciation for her effect on his sister. As summer yielded to autumn at Westmoreland Hall, a most unexpected ritual established itself with the quiet inevitability of changing seasons. Each morning following breakfast, the Duke would appear at precisely 9:30 in the East Garden, where Eleanor, having completed her early duties with Lady Catherine, would be waiting beside the stone fountain. Their walks began as brief, almost formal affairs, with conversation limited to polite inquiries about his sister's comfort or the weather. Gradually, however, as leaves began their transformation from vibrant green to burnished gold and fiery crimson, their conversations deepened like the enriching colours of the landscape around them. The Duke, Eleanor discovered, possessed a formidable intellect coupled with genuine curiosity about her opinions on subjects ranging from romantic poetry to agricultural improvements on the estate. Unlike many gentlemen of his station who viewed female education as merely ornamental, he listened to her thoughts with genuine consideration, often challenging her assertions not to dismiss them, but to explore their foundations more thoroughly. The gardens provided a constantly evolving backdrop to their developing connection, from the formal rosebeds near the house to the wild woodland paths that wound through ancient oaks at the property boundaries. On one particularly golden morning, as they paused beside a small stream where fallen leaves drifted like tiny boats on the current, the Duke regarded Eleanor with an expression she could not quite interpret, something between surprise and admiration. "In you, Miss Winters, I find a most refreshing honesty," he said, his deep voice carrying easily despite its softness. "Everyone else tells me what they think I wish to hear." Their mutual love of literature provided endless topics for discussion, with Eleanor sometimes startling herself by vigorously defending perspectives that contradicted his own, only to realize afterward the impropriety of debating so forcefully with her employer. Yet rather than taking offense, the Duke seemed to value these exchanges, often arriving the following morning with a relevant book tucked under his arm, earmarked passages ready to continue their discourse. Eleanor found herself anticipating these walks with increasing eagerness, spending evenings preparing thoughtful positions on topics they had touched upon, determined to prove herself worthy of such intellectual engagement. The man who emerged during these private conversations differed significantly from the stern, reserved Duke, observed by the household staff and local gentry. In the quiet sanctuary of the gardens, his rare smiles came more frequently, transforming his austere features into something approaching handsome, while his dry observations about society occasionally revealed a wit as sharp as it was unexpected. As autumn progressed, their walks lengthened, sometimes stretching well past the hour that propriety suggested, though always conducted in full view of the house. Neither acknowledged the subtle transformation occurring between them, how their initial employer-employee formality had developed into something more complex and potentially dangerous, a connection of minds that threatened to become a connection of hearts, if left unchecked. The peace that had settled over Westmoreland Hall shattered one crisp October afternoon when the Duchess of Westmoreland arrived in a flurry of silk and outrage, her elaborate travelling carriage sending gravel flying as it came to an abrupt halt before the main entrance. Eleanor had been assisting Lady Catherine with correspondence in the morning room when the commotion drew them to the window, the blood draining from both their faces as they recognized the ducal crest emblazoned on the carriage door. The Duchess had not been expected until Christmas, her London season typically extending well into late autumn, and her sudden appearance boded ill for the delicate harmony that had developed in her absence. Eleanor scarcely had time to retreat to her chambers before a summons arrived, delivered by a pale-faced maid who could barely meet her eyes. The formal dining room, rarely used for anything less than grand entertainments, had been chosen as the battlefield for this confrontation, its cavernous dimensions and imposing ancestral portraits lending gravity to the scene. The Duchess stood like an avenging fury beside the massive fireplace, her travelling clothes exchanged for a gown of midnight blue that emphasized the cold fire in her eyes as Eleanor entered. "You dare show your face in my home after attempting to ensnare my son," she hissed, advancing with such menace that Eleanor instinctively stepped backward. "I dismissed you once, you conniving little fortune hunter, yet here I find you having wormed your way into my daughter's confidence while I was absent." Only the timely arrival of the Duke prevented further verbal assault, his tall figure appearing in the doorway with a suddenness that suggested he had been summoned by some sixth sense that his protection was needed. Without hesitation, he positioned himself between Eleanor and his mother, his broad shoulders forming a physical barrier that spoke more eloquently than words of his determination to shield her from harm. "Mother, Miss Winters is here at my invitation," he stated, his quiet voice carrying more authority than the Duchess' shrill accusations. "You will treat her with the respect she deserves as a valued member of this household." The Duchess recoiled as though struck, her gaze darting between her son and Eleanor with dawning comprehension that transmuted rapidly into calculating rage. A tense silence descended upon the room, broken only by the occasional pop and hiss of logs burning in the massive fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the polished mahogany table, where servants had begun to lay out silver and crystal for the evening meal. Lady Catherine joined them minutes later, her entrance carefully timed to prevent further direct confrontation, yet the atmosphere remained charged throughout dinner, the Duchess alternating between glacial silence and barbed comments, thinly disguised as pleasantries. Eleanor maintained her composure through sheer force of will, aware that each coolly deflected insult impressed the Duke, whose watchful gaze seldom left her face. By meal's end, battle lines had been clearly drawn, with the Duchess on one side, Eleanor and Lady Catherine on the other, and the Duke standing as both buffer and judge between the factions. The stakes of this domestic war, now elevated far beyond a companion's position, to encompass the very heart of the Valmont family dynamics. 2 days after the Duchess' arrival, a letter bearing the seal of the War Office arrived at Westmoreland Hall, delivered by a grim-faced messenger who refused refreshment before continuing his journey. The butler presented it on a silver tray during breakfast, the heavy cream envelope seeming to pulsate with ominous significance against the polished surface. The Duke recognized the seal immediately, his face draining of color as he accepted it with steady fingers that belied the sudden tension in his shoulders. Eleanor watched, heart hammering against her ribs, as he broke the wax and unfolded the single sheet within, his grey eyes scanning the contents with increasing gravity. "Lord Thornfield has been reported missing after a skirmish near the Belgian border," he announced finally, his voice carefully controlled as he looked up to meet his mother's horrified gaze. Then, almost reluctantly, Eleanor's. The Duchess immediately dissolved into theatrical lamentations that required her to be escorted to her chambers by concerned ladies' maids, while Lady Catherine pressed her handkerchief to trembling lips, genuine concern for her nephew, evident in her gentle eyes. Eleanor sat frozen, aware that every person present expected grief from her, the woman presumed to have captured Lord Thornfield's heart, yet finding within herself only a distant, hollow sadness more appropriate for an acquaintance than a beloved. That night, alone in her modest bedchamber where moonlight cast long shadows across the simple furnishings that befitted her station, Eleanor confronted the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. Tears streamed down her face, not for Edward Thornfield, who might at this moment lie injured or worse on foreign soil, but for her own unconscionable heart that had so quickly transferred its affections to another, more impossible object. She paced the small room, her white nightgown ghostly in the silvery illumination, her unbound hair falling in dark waves past her waist as she wrapped her arms around herself in a futile attempt at comfort. "What kind of woman am I, to forget so quickly one who offered me everything?" she whispered to the empty room, shame burning in her breast as she acknowledged that while she prayed for Lord Thornfield's safety, it was his father's face that filled her thoughts, his father's voice that echoed in her dreams, his father's rare smile that caused her heart to flutter like a captive bird. The realization that she had fallen in love with the Duke of Westmoreland struck her with the force of physical pain, driving her to her knees beside the narrow bed where she buried her face in the counterpane to muffle her sobs. Such feelings could lead only to disaster, for even had she been worthy of a duke, which her rational mind knew she was not, she had been connected to his son, making any attachment between them doubly impossible. The cruelty of fate overwhelmed her as moonlight inched across the wooden floor, illuminating the tears that fell unchecked onto her clenched hands, each drop containing the bitter knowledge that she had discovered love, only to find it forever beyond her reach. Unable to find rest in the suffocating confines of her bedchamber, Eleanor slipped through the darkened corridors of Westmoreland Hall well past midnight, her slippered feet silent against the polished floors as she sought solace in the music room. Moonlight streamed through the tall mullioned windows, bathing the grand pianoforte in silvery illumination that beckoned her like a promise of peace. She had not intended to play, knowing the household might be disturbed, but her fingers found the keys unbidden, drawing forth the gentle melancholy of a Chopin nocturne that matched the ache in her heart. The music flowed from her like a confession, each note carrying the burden of emotions too complex for words, unaware that her solitude had been breached until a shadow fell across the moonlit keys. The Duke stood in the doorway, his tall figure unmistakable even in the dimness, still fully dressed despite the late hour, suggesting he too had found sleep elusive. Eleanor immediately ceased playing, rising in embarrassment to apologize for the disturbance, but he gestured for her to continue, moving into the room with quiet grace that belied his imposing stature. She resumed her place at the instrument, though her fingers trembled slightly as he took a seat in the window embrasure nearby, his face half illuminated by moonlight, half hidden in shadow as the nocturne filled the space between them, with exquisite melancholy. When the final notes faded into silence, neither spoke immediately, the night wrapping around them like a protective cloak, creating an intimacy outside the rigid constraints of daylight propriety. It was the Duke who finally broke the silence, his deep voice gentle as he observed that music often expressed what words could not, particularly when the heart was troubled. Something in his tone, in the unusual softness of his normally stern countenance, loosened the careful control Eleanor had maintained, words spilling forth in a whispered rush about her confusion, her guilt over feeling so little genuine grief for Lord Thornfield, while her heart had betrayed her by forming attachments where it should not. She expected judgment, perhaps even dismissal, yet when she dared raise her eyes to his face, she found only understanding in his steady gaze. The Duke moved then to stand beside the pianoforte, moonlight silvering his dark hair, as he spoke words that forever altered the landscape between them, stating quietly that he believed the heart knew its true home. Eleanor, and perhaps his son, had merely been a path that led her here. The sound of her given name on his lips, spoken with such tender intimacy, sent a tremor through her entire being. The formal barrier that had separated them, crumbling like ancient walls, no longer able to withstand the force of what grew between them. In that moonlit moment, with soft piano notes still echoing in the air around them, something irrevocable shifted, a recognition neither could any longer deny nor retreat from, whatever consequences might follow. The news arrived with the Morning Post 1 week later, a letter bearing foreign stamps and the unmistakable handwriting of Lord Thornfield himself. The household, gathered in the morning room, its cheerful yellow walls and chintz-covered furniture providing stark contrast to the somber atmosphere as the Duke broke the seal and read the contents aloud. Lord Thornfield was alive and well, having been rescued by Spanish allies following the skirmish that had separated him from his regiment. However, rather than returning immediately to England, he had fallen deeply in love with Doña Isabella Navarro, daughter of a Spanish nobleman who had sheltered him during his recovery, and had married her in a small ceremony at her family chapel. They would remain in Spain indefinitely, as Lord Thornfield had accepted a diplomatic position with the British envoy in Madrid. Stunned silence followed this revelation, broken only by the rhythmic lashing of autumn rain against the tall windows and the crackling of logs in the marble fireplace. The Duchess, who had maintained a frigid civility since her arrival, finally erupted with the venom she had been nurturing. "This," she declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Eleanor, "is your doing. Your coldness drove my son away. Your obvious fortune-hunting schemes disgusted him so thoroughly he fled to the continent and married a foreigner rather than fulfill his obligations." Eleanor felt the eyes of every person in the room turn toward her. Yet rather than the shame and humiliation such attention would have once provoked, she experienced a curious lightness, as if the final chain binding her to a path never truly her own had been severed. Meeting the Duchess' glare with steady composure, Eleanor spoke words that surprised even herself with their quiet conviction. "Your son found love, Your Grace. Should that not be cause for celebration rather than blame? No one deserves happiness more than Lord Thornfield, whose kindness to me I shall always remember with gratitude." The Duchess' face contorted with outrage at this unexpected defiance from a woman she considered far beneath her, but before she could respond, the Duke intervened, his expression revealing a complex mixture of relief and something more personal that caused Eleanor's heart to quicken. "My son has made his choice freely, Mother, as is his right," he stated, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's face. "We shall send our congratulations and welcome Doña Isabella to the family when they eventually return to England." Lady Catherine, who had observed the exchange with keen interest, reached out to squeeze Eleanor's hand in silent support, while the Duchess swept from the room in a rustle of expensive silk. Her defeat in this particular battle, evident to all present. Eleanor remained outwardly composed, though inwardly she marveled at the strange workings of fate that had simultaneously released her from a commitment she had not sought and revealed a strength within herself she had not known she possessed. The evening of the Westmoreland Harvest Ball arrived with all the pageantry befitting one of the premier social events in the county, the grand tradition restored after years of neglect following the death of the previous Duchess. Eleanor had initially assumed she would assist Lady Catherine with preparations before retreating to her chambers as befitted her position, until the Duke himself had appeared at the library doorway 3 days prior, to inform her that she would attend not as an employee, but as an honored guest. Lady Catherine, delighted by this development, had immediately offered the loan of a gown, insisting that her companion deserved this rare opportunity for enjoyment after weeks of devoted service. Now, as Eleanor stood before the looking-glass in her chambers, she scarcely recognized the woman who gazed back at her. The gown, a creation of midnight blue silk with silver embroidery that caught the light with every movement, transformed her slender figure into something almost regal. Lady Catherine's maid had arranged her chestnut hair in an elegant style, adorned with a single silver ornament, while the confidence that had gradually blossomed during her time at Westmoreland Hall added a glow to her complexion that no cosmetic could have achieved. The great ballroom of Westmoreland Hall glittered with the light of hundreds of beeswax candles reflected in gilt-framed mirrors and crystal chandeliers, their warm illumination complementing the autumn decorations of russet leaves and golden wheat sheaves artfully arranged throughout the space. Local nobility and gentry filled the room, their jewels and finery creating a kaleidoscope of color against the cream and gold decor as the orchestra played from the musicians' gallery overlooking the polished floor. Eleanor paused at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the splendor and the knowledge that every eye would turn toward her as she descended the marble staircase. The Duke stood at the bottom of the stairs, engaged in conversation with an elderly baronet, his tall figure commanding in formal black evening attire that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the distinguished silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. As if sensing her presence, he glanced up, the words dying on his lips as he beheld her. The naked admiration in his gaze gave Eleanor courage to begin her descent, each step measured and graceful as Lady Catherine had instructed during their hasty preparations. When she reached the final step, the Duke extended his hand to assist her, his fingers warm and steady against her gloved palm. "You outshine every star in the sky tonight," he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone despite the crowd surrounding them. The public acknowledgement of her elevated status could not have been clearer had he announced it aloud, for he led her not to the sidelines where companions typically observed festivities, but directly into the first quadrille, positioning her at his side where a hostess or honored guest would traditionally stand, his actions declaring to all present that Miss Eleanor Winters held a place of singular importance in the household and heart of the Duke of Westmoreland. The euphoria of the evening could not last, for the Duchess of Westmoreland had observed her son's unprecedented attention to Eleanor with mounting fury, biding her time until the moment was right to strike with maximum effect. That moment arrived during a brief pause between dances, as Eleanor stood conversing with Lady Catherine and several local gentry who had been drawn by curiosity to the mysterious young woman who had captured the Duke's favor. The Duchess approached with the deceptive smoothness of a cobra, her crimson gown rustling ominously against the polished floor, jewels glittering at her throat and wrists like armor as she positioned herself within the circle, interrupting the conversation with practiced precision. "I believe our guests might appreciate knowing more about Miss Winters' background," she announced, her voice pitched to carry beyond their immediate group, drawing the attention of nearby dancers who stilled to listen. Her father was a failed scholar who died in debt, leaving his daughter to seek employment as a governess to avoid the poorhouse. She attempted to secure her future through my younger son, and having failed there, has now clearly set her sights on a greater prize. The Duchess' words fell like stones into still water, ripples of whispers spreading outward as the orchestra faltered, musicians sensing the sudden tension that gripped the ballroom. Eleanor felt the physical impact of every eye turning toward her, the weight of judgment and speculation threatening to crush her newly found confidence. For one terrible moment, she was again the trembling governess in the drawing room at Thornfield Manor, diminished by cruel words designed to remind her of her place. Yet something had changed within her during these months at Westmoreland Hall, a strength born of being truly seen and valued by those whose opinions mattered most. Drawing herself to her full height, Eleanor met the Duchess' contemptuous gaze directly, her voice clear and steady as it carried through the now silent ballroom. "I am the daughter of a scholar and a loving mother," she acknowledged, her words gathering power with each syllable. "My father dedicated his life to knowledge rather than fortune, and while that choice left me without material wealth, it provided riches of mind and spirit that cannot be taken away. I may lack fortune, Your Grace, but I have never lacked character." The simple dignity of her response hung in the air, touching even those who had been prepared to enjoy the spectacle of her humiliation. Lady Catherine reached out to clasp Eleanor's hand in silent support, while several of the county gentry who had initially drawn back now stepped closer, their expressions transformed from curiosity to respect. The Duchess stood momentarily speechless, her carefully orchestrated attack having produced an outcome entirely different from what she had intended, for in attempting to diminish Eleanor, she had instead revealed the smallness of her own character against the quiet nobility of her target. The tension in the ballroom crystallized into perfect stillness as the Duchess stood triumphant before Eleanor, certain her victory was complete. Then movement caught the collective eye of the assembly as the Duke of Westmoreland strode purposefully across the gleaming floor, his expression one of such controlled intensity that guests instinctively stepped aside to clear his path. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had reached a momentous decision, his tall figure commanding attention with each measured step. Upon reaching Eleanor, he took her gloved hand in his and raised it to rest upon his arm in a gesture of unmistakable possession and protection, the simple action declaring his allegiance more eloquently than words ever could. When he spoke, his deep voice carried effortlessly to every corner of the hushed ballroom, its usual reserve transformed into something vibrant with conviction. "The woman you attempt to shame has more nobility in her heart than many born to title," he stated, addressing his mother while his steady gaze never left Eleanor's face. True worth is found not in fortune or bloodlines but in character, intelligence, and strength of spirit, qualities Miss Winters possesses in abundance. The Duchess recoiled as though physically struck, her expression contorting with disbelief as her son continued, his voice softening with an emotion no one present had ever witnessed him display. "I find myself quite hopelessly in love with you, Miss Winters," he confessed, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would forever alter the landscape of their lives. A collective gasp arose from the assembled guests, followed by a rising tide of whispers that swept through the room like wind through autumn leaves. Candlelight caught and illuminated the tears that welled in Eleanor's eyes, transforming them into liquid stars that matched the trembling radiance of the chandeliers above. The Duke remained steadfast before her, seemingly oblivious to the scandal erupting around them. His world narrowed to the face of the woman whose arrival had awakened feelings he had long believed himself incapable of experiencing. Eleanor stood transfixed, scarcely breathing as the magnitude of his declaration registered in her consciousness, for he had not merely defended her, he had elevated her above all others in the most public manner possible, regardless of consequence or convention. The orchestra, sensing the momentous nature of the occasion, spontaneously began to play again, a sweeping waltz that seemed to gather the chaotic emotions swirling through the ballroom and transform them into something ordered and beautiful. The music washed over the tableau at the center of the floor, where a duke and a former governor stood hand in hand, their shared gaze forming an island of perfect understanding amid a sea of speculation and wonder. Dawn broke over Westmoreland Hall, painting the sky in delicate washes of rose and gold that gradually dispersed the shadows of night. Eleanor had scarcely slept, the Duke's declaration replaying in her mind like music that refused to fade with waking. She had just finished dressing in a simple morning gown of sage green, when a soft knock at her door announced a footman bearing a note written in a strong, decisive hand, requesting her presence in the East Garden at her earliest convenience. Heart fluttering like a captive bird, Eleanor made her way through the quiet corridors of the great house and out into the crisp autumn morning, where frost gilded the formal hedges and fountains with crystalline brilliance. The Duke awaited her beside the entrance to the gardens, his tall figure silhouetted against the rising mist that clung to the ground like diaphanous silk, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and otherworldly. Without speaking, he offered his arm, and Eleanor placed her gloved hand upon it, allowing him to guide her along paths now strewn with fallen leaves in russet and gold, their footsteps muffled by nature's carpet. She realized their destination even before they turned the final corner, a sense of perfect symmetry filling her as the stone pavilion came into view, the very place where they had first truly seen one another, beyond the constraints of rank and circumstance during that summer storm. Morning light filtered through the surrounding trees, dappling the structure with patterns that shifted and danced with every breeze, while mist rose around its base like the gentle breathing of the earth itself. Inside, autumn roses arranged in a simple crystal vase perfumed the air with sweet fragrance, evidence of careful preparation that caused Eleanor's heart to beat faster still. The Duke turned to face her, his customary reserve softened by an emotion so profound it transformed his austere features into something approaching tenderness. Then, to her utter astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee before her, this man, who stood above almost all others in England, this Duke, who knelt to no one, now looking up at Eleanor Winters with eyes that contained his entire heart. "I care nothing for fortune or connections," he said, his deep voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I care only for the woman who has awakened my heart after so many years of slumber. You have brought light and laughter back to Westmoreland, Eleanor, not only to my sister and the household, but to me most of all. I ask not as a duke seeking a duchess, but as a man who has found his other half. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Eleanor stood transfixed, the morning light streaming through the pavilion windows to illuminate them both in its golden glow. Time suspended in this perfect moment of transformation, where past and future merged into a single point of possibility, centered on the man kneeling before her, and the love that had blossomed between them against all odds. The confrontation that would determine the fate of Westmoreland unfolded not in the grand ballroom where love had been declared, but in the intimate confines of the Duke's study the following afternoon. Ancient portraits of Vallemont ancestors gazed down from panelled walls as if bearing witness to this pivotal moment in their lineage, their painted eyes seeming to follow the Duchess as she paced before the massive oak desk where her son sat with uncharacteristic stillness. Autumn sunlight streamed through leaded windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between mother and son, like physical manifestations of the tension binding them. The Duchess had summoned every weapon in her considerable arsenal, beginning with icy disapproval before progressing to tearful appeals to family duty, then finally arriving at naked threats delivered in a voice that could have frozen the nearby Thames in midsummer. "If you persist in this madness, this unsuitable alliance with a penniless nobody, I shall be forced to take drastic measures," she declared, her jeweled fingers gripping the back of a leather chair until her knuckles whitened. "The Westmoreland fortune is largely mine to control until my death, and I will not hesitate to disinherit you entirely if you bring such disgrace upon our name. Family connections cultivated over centuries will be severed, doors once open to you will close forever, and you will find yourself with nothing but a title and an empty treasury." Throughout her tirade, the Duke remained unnaturally calm, his grey eyes never leaving his mother's face as she enumerated the catastrophic consequences awaiting him should he follow his heart. When she finally paused for breath, her chest heaving with emotion, he rose to his full height, his quiet dignity forming a stark contrast to her passionate display. "Then I shall be merely the happiest man in England rather than the richest," he replied, his deep voice carrying absolute conviction. "Westmoreland will survive, as it has survived wars, plagues, and civil strife. The land remains productive, the tenants loyal, and with Eleanor by my side, I shall have something no amount of wealth could purchase, a partner who values me for myself rather than my position." Something remarkable happened then, a subtle shift in the Duchess' expression as she truly looked at her son perhaps for the first time in years. She saw not the dutiful heir she had shaped and controlled, but a man of unwavering resolve whose capacity for love she had never suspected, and in that moment of recognition, something within her finally yielded. Her shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, the fire of battle fading from her eyes as she acknowledged, without words, that this was one victory she would not claim. The silence that fell between them held neither triumph nor bitterness, merely the quiet acknowledgement that a fundamental transformation had occurred in their relationship, one that might eventually lead to understanding if not immediate reconciliation. When the Duchess finally departed, her exit lacked the dramatic flourish that had characterized her previous confrontations, suggesting that perhaps beneath her rigid adherence to tradition lay a mother who, despite everything, wanted her son's happiness after all. The small Norman church in Westmoreland village had stood for centuries, bearing silent witness to generations of local marriages, yet never before had its ancient stones observed the wedding of a duke within its modest walls. Winter sunshine streamed through stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across stone floors and oak pews as Eleanor Winters stood before the weathered altar beside the Duke of Westmoreland, her hand trembling slightly in his steady grasp. The simplicity of the setting had been the Duke's suggestion, a deliberate choice that spoke eloquently of the values that had drawn them together, substance over show, genuine connection over empty pageantry. Lady Catherine stood beside Eleanor as bridesmaid, her delicate features alight with joy. A bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the estate gardens clutched in her slender hands, matching the simple blooms that adorned the church in garlands and arrangements, their natural beauty requiring no enhancement from exotic hothouse specimens. What made the gathering truly remarkable was not the setting, but the assembly that filled every available space within the ancient church, tenant farmers and village shopkeepers, seated alongside earls and baronets, the strict divisions of class temporarily suspended in celebration of a love that had transcended such boundaries. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk, elegant in its simplicity, her chestnut hair adorned with a coronet of white roses and winter greenery, rather than the diamond tiara traditionally worn by Vallemont brides. While the Duke had foregone his most formal attire, in favor of a dark blue coat that matched his eyes, softening his usual austere appearance. The ceremony proceeded with quiet dignity, ancient vows exchanged in voices that grew stronger with each promise, until the moment arrived for the Duke to place the gold band upon Eleanor's finger, a simple circle engraved with intertwining leaves that symbolized their growing love. "I never dreamed of such happiness," Eleanor whispered as he slipped the ring into place, her voice carrying in the hushed church, tears of joy trembling on her lashes like morning dew. The transformation of the moment struck all who witnessed it. How a woman once cruelly dismissed as too poor to marry one Valmont now freely gave her heart to another, how rejection had ultimately led to a deeper, truer love than either could have imagined possible. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, a shaft of winter sunlight broke through clouds to illuminate them both, nature itself seeming to bless this unlikely union born of genuine affection rather than calculation or convenience. The Duke of Westmoreland, known throughout his life for his reserve and restraint, smiled with such unguarded joy that those who knew him best scarcely recognized him, his transformation as profound as the seasonal change from winter to spring, from isolation to connection, from duty to love. 3 years after their wedding day, spring sunshine streamed through the tall windows of the nursery at Westmoreland Hall, bathing the cheerful blue and white chamber in golden light that danced across polished oak floors and illuminated the scene within like a painter's masterpiece. Eleanor, now the Duchess of Westmoreland, sat in a gently rocking chair beside the window, their newborn son cradled against her breast, his tiny hand curled around her finger with surprising strength as he slept, blissfully unaware of his importance as heir to one of England's oldest dukedoms. The Duke stood behind her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, his normally austere features softened by an expression of such profound contentment that the transformation from the stern, isolated man he had once been seemed nothing short of miraculous. Into this tableau of domestic happiness stepped the elderly Duchess, moving with the dignity that decades at the pinnacle of society had instilled, though time and reflection had gentled the sharp edges of her personality, rounding them like stones in a riverbed. She paused at the threshold, observing the family group with an expression that held something previously unimaginable, genuine warmth toward the woman she had once dismissed so cruelly. The past 3 years had witnessed a gradual thawing between the generations, begun when Eleanor had reached out to the Dowager Duchess during her isolation in London, inviting her to return to Westmoreland, not as a vanquished adversary, but as a valued elder whose experience and wisdom might benefit the estate she had served for so long. Today marked the culmination of that reconciliation as the elder Duchess approached the rocking chair, extending tentative fingers to touch the sleeping infant's downy head with a reverence that belied her former hardness. "You have given this family something far more valuable than fortune, my dear," she said softly to Eleanor, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won recognition. "You have given it heart." In those words lay acknowledgement of the transformation Eleanor had brought to Westmoreland, not merely in the tangible improvements to tenant cottages and village school that had occupied her energetic attention, but in the intangible renewal of connection between Duke and people, mother and son, past and future, that her presence had facilitated. The Duke tightened his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, his eyes meeting hers in silent communication that needed no words, for they had traveled a path together that few could comprehend. From rejection to the deepest love, from isolation to family, from judgment to acceptance. Outside, the gardens of Westmoreland bloomed in riotous color, much as Eleanor herself had blossomed from the trembling governess who once stood before the Duchess in humiliation to this confident woman who had found her true place, not through fortune or connection, but through the strength of her character and the boundless capacity of her heart, proving beyond doubt that sometimes what appears to be our greatest defeat merely opens the door to our greatest triumph.